The Korean War is usually remembered for its speed, rapid advances, sudden reversals, and a front line that seemed to freeze in place almost overnight. What is less remembered is how often success or failure depended on waiting, sometimes deliberately doing nothing at all. One of the quiet realities of the war was that some of the most valuable building material on the battlefield was timber that had already been cut but deliberately left unused. In a conflict defined by urgency, restraint with resources became a form of discipline, and ignoring that discipline carried real consequences. If you find value in these quieter dimensions of history, where patience and preparation mattered as much as firepower, consider subscribing to History Matters. This channel is built for viewers who want to understand how wars were actually sustained, not just how they were fought. The Korean War really showed us that using materials too soon could be just as risky as not having enough in the first place. It's a lesson that, honestly, was learned the hard way. By 1950, military logistics, they really leaned toward immediate consumption. Supplies were expected to move forward and be used up quickly. Timber, when it was available, was often cut and assembled as fast as possible, sometimes without much thought for the consequences. In Korea, this kind of approach, it just kept backfiring. Freshly cut wood, used right away, behaved in all sorts of unpredictable ways under those extreme conditions. It warped, it cracked, and it weakened right at the very moment when those structures were needed most. So engineers began to notice a pattern. You see, positions that were built hastily in the autumn needed constant repair by the time winter arrived. But those that were constructed from older, seasoned wood, even though that kind of wood was much scarcer, actually lasted longer and needed far less intervention. The real issue here, oddly enough, wasn't about quantity, but timing. Old timber, it carried qualities that newly cut wood simply did not. Timber that had been left untouched for months or even years had already undergone its most violent changes. Its moisture levels had stabilized, and any internal stresses had, relaxed. The wood had revealed its weaknesses early through visible cracks and distortions rather than later under load. Using such timber, honestly, reduced uncertainty. In Korea's climate, uncertainty was dangerous. Freeze-thaw cycles, really punished internal moisture. Snow loads, they tested roof beams to their limits. And all that damp soil, it just relentlessly attacked ground contact posts. Older timber, interestingly enough, performed more predictably because, honestly, time had already done part of the work that treatment simply couldn't rush. Leaving timber untouched was, more often than not, a conscious logistical decision, not neglect. Contrary to later assumptions, unused timber stockpiles were not always signs of inefficiency. In several rear-area depots and forward engineering sites, wood was deliberately cut and stacked well ahead of need. It was protected from direct ground contact and left to season naturally. This required planning, security, and confidence that future needs would justify present restraint. Commanders who allowed this practice accepted short-term inconvenience in exchange for long-term reliability. Those who demanded immediate use often paid for it later through failures that consumed more time and resources than the original delay would have. Local knowledge, really reinforced the value of waiting. Korean civilian construction traditions emphasized, patience with wood. Timber was often cut in winter when sap content was low and then left unused until conditions were just right. This practice honestly was shaped by generations of experience with harsh seasonal changes. At first, the Allied forces, they really overlooked this local knowledge, choosing instead to focus on speed and standardization. But, as time went on, engineers who actually paid attention started to adopt similar approaches. Timber was cut during periods of low sap flow and stored until it stabilized. These decisions, though rarely celebrated, honestly reduced maintenance demands and, in the end, improved the durability of the shelters. The pressure to build quickly often came from misunderstanding risk. In wartime, delay is often equated with vulnerability. Korea challenged that assumption. A bunker that collapsed under snow or moisture was more dangerous than a delayed one built correctly. The real risk lay in structures that appeared complete, but were structurally compromised from the start. This forced a reassessment of what readiness meant. Readiness was not merely having something in place, but having something that would endure. The consequences of ignoring this lesson were cumulative rather than dramatic. There were no single disasters tied to premature timber use. Instead, there was attrition. Roofs sagged, walls shifted, supports failed gradually. Each failure required repair, diverting manpower and attention. Over time, this eroded operational efficiency. Units that used seasoned timber reported fewer interruptions and lower maintenance demands. These advantages compounded quietly, reinforcing the value of patience. Post-war military engineering doctrine absorbed this lesson indirectly. After the Korean War, manuals really began to emphasize things like seasoning, moisture control, and environmental compatibility. While these guidelines weren't always described using the word weighting, the principle itself was, kind of embedded in the new standards. Timber was no longer seen as just an instantly usable commodity. Instead, it started to be recognized as a material with its own, life cycle. This shift influenced later conflicts, where timber continued to be necessary, often because of the terrain or supply constraints. The lesson carried forward, even as its origins faded from memory. For survival-minded observers, the lesson extends beyond the battlefield. Preparedness often rewards those who resist the urge to act immediately. Materials need time to reveal their behavior. Using resources at the right moment can matter more than using them quickly. Old timber was valuable, not because it was old, but because it had already proven itself. This applies as much to shelters and tools as it does to planning and decision-making. Time is not always the enemy. Sometimes, it is the test that ensures reliability. The deeper meaning is that war exposes the cost of impatience. Korea showed that, modern forces, despite advanced logistics, could still be undone by simple material realities. Leaving timber untouched until the right moment was not passive. It was actually a form of strategic restraint shaped by experience. Remembering these stories matters because, they remind us that effectiveness is often quiet, cumulative, and, honestly, unglamorous. If you value this kind of historical analysis, consider subscribing to History Matters and sharing this video. These lessons remain relevant wherever people must build, endure, and decide under pressure. History Matters.